Okay, so this is the second study in the series Imagine All the People in the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew chapter 5. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 to 16 for this study. So, again, I encourage you to read it first, think about it, meditate on it, read it a couple times, write down questions you have, write down comments that interesting things that you found in the passage before we get into it. So if you haven't done that, again, pause it, go ahead and do that. But yeah, basically, Jesus says, telling his disciples, "You're the salt of the earth, you're the light of the world, you're a city set on a hill," right? So, and he's telling the people, he's telling his disciples not to hide it, not to hide the light, that the light has to shine and salt has to be salty. And I think it's kind of like common sense. It's like, obviously salt has to be salty, and obviously light has to be shining. Or what is it? It's not even a light if it doesn't shine. It's not even salt if it's not salty. And that's basically Jesus' point. Jesus' point is, just as how obvious the salt is supposed to be salty, followers of Jesus, disciples of Jesus, are supposed to do good works and get glory for God. It should be that obvious, but it's not. And so he's trying to make it that obvious. So what does salt do? Salt influences the taste of the food for the better. So it influences the rest of the food, just as the disciples or Jesus' followers are supposed to influence the rest of the world to make it better, to make it a better place, to make the world worship God. What does the light do? Light gives like guidance to people. If you can see where you want to go, so the just like the light does that, the disciples are supposed to give light to the world so that the world can see, oh, this is the right path to God. So that's the analogy that basically Jesus is making. So now a passage I want to read that I think has a lot of relevance to this passage, again, because Jesus is really steeped in the Old Testament. So all of his thinking is comes from the Old Testament. His entire culture is like the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, is just in there all the time. So everything that comes out of him has relationship to the Old Testament. In Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, it says, "This is what Isaiah son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his path. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations. He will settle disputes for many peoples. He will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore.'" So when Jesus says the words that it's a city on a hill, that the disciples are supposed to be a city set on the hill, or a town on a hill, he's calling back to these passages where Jerusalem is a city and Zion is the name of the hill that the city was built on. So most of the cities in the Old Testament or in ancient times were built on hills because they were harder to take, and they would have walls around them. So you'd go up and you get to a wall, and then they can like shoot arrows or do whatever they need to do to defend the city. And so, like a city on the hill, he's talking about how Jerusalem is on a hill and it's supposed to be a beacon of light for all the nations. The picture here is that all peoples are coming to the temple in Jerusalem, worshiping God, and then they're going out and taking God's laws and practices with them and influencing all the nations because of it. So that's what Jerusalem was supposed to be. It hasn't really been that way up to Jesus' time. And Jesus is saying, this is still the vision I want, but it's for the disciples to carry it out. You guys are supposed to carry out the vision of Isaiah, which is to be a city on the hill. It's to be this nation, this society that lives God's law so well that everyone will be just attracted to it, wanted to come to it and worship God because of it. So that vision is still carrying on, and it's part of Jesus's vision. It is Jesus's vision for the kingdom of heaven that he's bringing, that he's ushering in. So it's not a new vision, really. Jesus is saying, this is my vision for the kingdom of heaven, is the same vision as what Isaiah taught in Isaiah chapter 2. So again, he's drawing from the prophets. He's drawing from the prophets for their vision of the future. And a lot of prophets talked about this society that would influence all nations. So what happens in the rest of the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus talks about a lot of the things you probably heard about anger, about lust, about divorce, about different ways to live life, a concept of morality. If someone asks for you to travel a mile with them, you go 2 miles, different things like that. So that's the Sermon on the Mount. And what happens is this salt and light vision, he's saying this is our goal. And these are the ways we're going to live it out. These are the more practical ways that this is done. This is our goal. We're supposed to be salt and light. We're supposed to live such good lives that everyone sees what we do and worships God. And how do we live that good of a life? Here, let me give you some examples. Someone wants you to walk a mile. You walk 2. Someone gives you, those kind of things. Turn the other cheek. So it's a radical new way of living, but the purpose is because you're supposed to live so radically that everyone in the entire world is attracted to God. I think the last part of this is that it's a city. The vision as a city. So it's not just an individual. And I think this is a lesson that probably we as Western Christians and individualistic American society kind of need to learn, is that Jesus, and in the Old Testament, it's always been the entire people. And Jesus is saying it's a city on a hill. It's not an individual person that is going to go and make the difference in the world. It requires more than just one person saying, hey, let's say it's a super rich person. I'm going to change the world by, using all my money, Bill Gates or whoever. He can't. It requires a city. It requires a set of relationships, because in order for the world to change, it needs to change relationally. The ways we interact with each other need to change. So because of that, it's like an alternative society is actually what is needed, that's already living out what's the way that we're supposed to live, and then inviting others into it. That's Jesus' strategy, actually, for evangelism. That's Jesus' strategy for reaching and changing the world for a better place, for justice, for peace. And so we can't just isolate and say, okay, we're missionaries that go out, and just missionaries go out and that's it. I mean, I'm not saying that missionaries can't go out. Jesus sent out missionaries himself. But when missionaries go out, the goal is to establish a community, that community will reach the rest of the communities around them. And so that's always been part of the strategy. And that's why the church is actually very important, because the church is those relationships. It's not going to be any individual person. And you might say, oh, what about like parachurch organizations or NGOs or different? And I think those can be churches, actually, in as much as they're living in relationship with each other and not just doing what they're supposed to do. And they have to actually live with each other, forgive each other, demonstrate that type of love, demonstrate going an extra mile. And when we do those and model those things, that's Jesus' strategy for actually changing the world. And I'm not saying that NGOs or parachurches can't do good work. They can, but they are actually supplementing the main work which is being done by the church. So they made, so I think that that's specifically Jesus' strategy right there. Okay, so also as we think about living the story out, it's not actually that the church changes the world. That doesn't say that anywhere in the Bible. It's actually God and the gospel that changes people's hearts and changes the world. But what happens is the church is that light, right? It's still God who's going to move the person to the light. It's still God who's going to actually change the people, but we are at the city on a hill is a model. it sparks the imagination. It helps people realize that it's possible. So it's only one part of the work that's being done. It's a very small part. It's the planting the seed. Really, God's making it grow. Okay? And as we think about how to live it in our lives, part of this is that, hey, are you a follower of Jesus? Do you want to be a follower of Jesus? And I say the word follower of Jesus, not Christian, because following Jesus is a hard thing and it's very clear. Whereas sometimes we want to become Christian and we think it's easy. But Jesus is calling us to be his follower, and not only be his follower, but to take up this role that he's giving us of being salt and light.